The Sands Hotel, Las Vegas. A September night in the mid-1960s when the city still pulsed with Sinatra's heartbeat and the Rat Pack ruled the desert like benevolent kings. The Copa Room was packed wall to wall with high rollers clutching martini glasses, movie stars hiding behind dark sunglasses, and tourists who'd mortgaged their vacations just to breathe the same air as legends. The orchestra gleamed under spotlights, brass instruments catching the light like captured stars. Cigarette smoke drifted through the room like incense in a cathedral of cool, and the electric hum of anticipation made the very walls seem to vibrate with possibility. And then he walked out. Dean Martin. The king of cool. The man who made midnight look like noon, who turned drinking into an art form, who could make forgetting your troubles seem like the most sophisticated thing you could do with an evening. He moved across that stage like he owned not just the building, but the entire desert beyond it. Tuxedo hanging perfectly imperfect, tie just crooked enough to suggest he didn't care, that eternal drink in his hand, apple juice masquerading as whiskey, though the 600 souls in that room would never know the difference. The audience erupted. They weren't just applauding Dean Martin, they were applauding the idea of him. The fantasy that life could be effortless, that pain could be dissolved in laughter, that a man could be unbreakable simply by refusing to acknowledge that anything could break him. But that afternoon, someone had tried to crack that facade. In the plush, velvet-lined office upstairs, a casino executive, one of the new breed who understood profit margins better than human souls, had dared to give Dean Martin instructions. The conversation was brief. The message was surgical. The act's getting too loose, Dean. Sing more. Joke less. Give them the hits, not the shtick. The numbers are good, but they could be better. Songs sell drinks. Songs keep them gambling after you leave the stage. Dean had listened with that sleepy, half-lidded expression that could mean anything or nothing. He'd nodded once, that slow, almost lazy nod that made people think he was agreeing, when he was really just filing the information away in some locked drawer of his mind. He'd smiled that smile that never quite reached his eyes and said, "Sure, whatever you say." Now it was showtime. The band struck the opening chords. The spotlight hit him like a blessing. Dean walked to the microphone, took a sip of his prop whiskey, and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. He glanced toward the VIP booth where the executive sat, smug and waiting for a polished, obedient performance. The orchestra swelled, ready to launch into That's Amore or Everybody Loves Somebody or any of the hits that had made him a millionaire. Instead, Dean Martin did something that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. He walked past the center mark he'd stood on 1,000 times, dragged a plain wooden stool into the spotlight, and sat down. The music faltered, then stopped entirely. He lit a cigarette, crossed his legs, and for 20 minutes, 20 long, impossible, career-threatening minutes, the most famous entertainer on earth did absolutely nothing the way they wanted it done. No songs. Just silence. Just a man on a stool, proving that he didn't need their permission to be magnificent. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now let's go back to that September night when a man decided his soul was worth more than a casino's bottom line. The boy from Steubenville never imagined he'd become a king, but he learned early that survival meant becoming someone else entirely. In his father's cramped barbershop that smelled of talcum powder and broken dreams, young Dino Crescetti listened to the rhythm of his world, clippers buzzing against tired necks, the murmur of Italian and broken English mixing like oil and water, the doorbell jingling as coal miners and mill, workers tracked in the cold and their troubles. His father barely spoke English, cutting hair with hands that knew poverty like an old prayer. His mother whispered Italian lullabies in the kitchen while she kneaded dough, her fingers never stopping, as if stillness might invite disaster. But somewhere inside all that noise, A boy with shy eyes discovered magic. If you timed a joke just right, the whole room changed. The arguments between tired men softened. The sighs of the overworked turned into chuckles. A well-placed wisecrack could rinse the heaviness out of the air for a few precious seconds, and suddenly everyone could breathe again. It felt like power, the kind you could wield without throwing a punch or raising your voice. If you make them laugh, they can't hurt you. If you make it look easy, they won't see how hard you're working just to survive. He carried that lesson through a series of odd jobs that taught him the sound of American struggle. The bell in a dingy boxing gym that rang in his ears long after the sparring stopped. Dice rattling in his palm long after he'd left the backroom tables. The whistle of steel mills where men lost pieces of themselves for wages that barely covered the rent. But gradually, another sound began to rise above it all: applause. First in small Ohio clubs, then bigger rooms, then radio, then Hollywood. The laughter rolled over him in warm waves, and it was always the same song: "You make us feel lighter." Do it again. By the time he hit Las Vegas in the 1960s, Dean Martin had constructed the most sophisticated suit of armor in the history of show business. The world saw a man who didn't give a damn, a beautiful lush who stumbled onto stages and accidentally created magic. It was the greatest performance of his life, precisely because it was a lie. The amber liquid in his glass was almost always apple juice. The slurred speech was practiced with the precision of a brain surgeon. The missed cues were choreographed. Dean was often the most sober man in the room, watching the world through half-lidded eyes, sharp and terrifyingly aware of everything happening around him. The drunk act became his masterpiece of misdirection. Night after night, he'd stumble out with that crooked grin and a rocks glass, slurring just enough to seem delightfully loose, dangerously unpredictable. Audiences leaned forward, thrilled by the illusion of chaos, never knowing they were watching one of the most disciplined performers in the business. He played the drunk because it lowered the stakes, made people trust him more. If you're already stumbling, no one expects you to carry the weight of the world. If you're already broken, you can't disappoint anyone. But the soundtrack of Dean Martin's Vegas was changing, and he heard every discordant note. The old guard mobsters who ran the town on handshakes and blood oaths were being replaced by a new kind of gangster: the corporate accountant. These men in expensive suits didn't care about loyalty or the rhythm of a show or the unspoken contract between performer and audience. They cared about turnover, about units per hour, about maximizing profit from every minute on stage. They looked at the Copa Room not as a cathedral of entertainment, but as a factory floor. They looked at Dean and didn't see an artist. They saw an asset that needed optimization. Dean felt this shift in his bones because he moved through the world with a quiet, almost religious code of integrity. While executives calculated spreadsheets, he heard human beings. He was the star who would slip a $100 bill into a stagehand's pocket to pay for a sick child's medicine, then threaten to fire anyone who spoke about it. When the hotel cut a musician's pay, Dean made up the difference in an envelope that rustled softly, passed hand to hand with no witnesses. When a stagehand's wife got sick, his manager's phone would ring with quiet instructions: "Don't worry about the bill." No press, no photos. Just the soft click of a receiver and the understanding that someone in this echoing, noisy kingdom still heard you. He knew the names of the dishwashers and the lighting technicians, the invisible people who made the gods look golden. To Dean, they were the only reality in a city built on mirages. The veteran doorman who'd been there since the beginning, the cocktail waitress supporting 3 kids on tips, the elderly wardrobe woman who reminded him of his mother and told stories about when performers were family. These people mattered more than profit margins. So when the whispers started, when longtime staff members began disappearing overnight, replaced by younger faces who cost less and asked fewer questions, something in Dean began to harden. The warm family feeling of the backstage world was turning corporate and cold. The machine was trying to grind down the humanity of the place he called home, and the men in suits wanted him to be complicit. They wanted the king of cool without the inconvenient burden of the man inside the suit. They wanted a jukebox that sang the hits, told the approved jokes, and kept the liquor flowing. On that particular September afternoon, when a casino executive dared to give Dean Martin instructions about how to be Dean Martin, the crack in the system finally made a noise he couldn't ignore. It sounded like a man in a suit telling him to sing more, joke less, maximize the product. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the applause and the jokes and the fake ice clinking in his glass, something broke just enough to let the truth be heard. Dean realized he had spent 15 years perfecting the art of looking like he didn't care. Tonight, he was going to find out what happened when he actually stopped caring about their expectations and started caring about the people who made his world possible. The carpet in the executive office was thick enough to swallow secrets, deep crimson velvet that absorbed, sound like a confessional booth. This was the new Vegas, all polish and profit margins, where mahogany desks stretched like barricades and floor-to-ceiling windows reduced the chaotic human world below to a silent light show. The air smelled of expensive cologne and fresh ambition, sterile as a surgical suite. Dean walked in alone. No entourage, no bodyguards. Just a man in a perfectly cut suit with his tie loosened like always, moving with that languid grace that made everything look effortless. The executive stood when he entered, all polished teeth and calculated handshakes, the kind that squeezed too hard to prove something Dean already understood about borrowed authority. They represented two different species of power. The executive had influence because someone gave it to him, a title on a door and commands filtered down from men who actually built this desert kingdom. Dean was power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself or lean forward to make a point. The conversation began wrapped in compliments, but Dean heard the blade underneath. The numbers were good, sure, but they could be better. Much better. When Dean did his extended comedy bits, drink orders slowed down. People stopped consuming because they were listening. When he sang, they ordered. The rhythm was better for consumption. The message was surgical. Give them the hits, not the humanity. Sing more, joke less. Cut the banter. Turn the tables faster for the second show. Efficiency was the name of the game now. Dean listened with that sleepy, half-lidded expression that made people think he was barely paying attention when he was actually cataloging every word, every assumption behind the demand. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make the executive uncomfortable, understanding that men who needed noise to feel important would always fill the gaps, revealing more than they intended. In that silence, a memory rose unbidden. 3 days earlier, he'd sat in a folding chair in his son's elementary school gymnasium, watching young Dean Paul walk onto a makeshift stage in a papier muck crown. The boy had frozen under the lights, forgotten every line, stood there terrified while parents shifted uncomfortably and other kids whispered cues from the wings. Most fathers would have felt embarrassment, that hot flush of secondhand shame. But Dean had felt pure, uncomplicated pride. Because in that moment, his son wasn't performing. He was just a scared kid being honest about being scared, and there was more truth in that silence than in all the polished performances Dean had given in years. Now this man wanted him to be a machine. To stop being human and start being product. Dean nodded once, that slow movement that could mean agreement or dismissal or absolutely nothing. He'd been performing for ghosts for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to sing for actual people. Every night he entertained expectations. The audience's expectation of the drunk, the casino's expectation of profit, his own expectation that the mask would hold. He'd become so good at giving people what they thought they wanted that he'd lost track of what he actually had to offer. He stood, smoothed his jacket with those elegant hands, and looked at the executive with an expression that might have been amusement or pity or something deeper the younger man couldn't read. "Sure," he said softly, his voice gentle as a lullaby. "Whatever you say." As he walked out, he paused at the door, backlit by hallway light. "I'll give you a show tonight," he promised. "The best one you've ever seen." The executive smiled, thinking he'd won. He had no idea Dean Martin had just declared the quietest, most devastating rebellion imaginable. Downstairs, Dean found his band leader by the loading dock and said just one thing: "Keep playing tonight, no matter what I do." The band leader looked at Dean's face, really looked at it, and saw something he'd never seen before. Not the cool, not the mask, something raw and dangerous and completely unpredictable. He would say later that he knew in that moment something unprecedented was about to happen. He just didn't know it would change the way people thought about courage. All three model responses successfully capture the core narrative elements requested for Chapter 3, maintaining the established tone and style guide. Each response effectively depicts Dean's rebellion against corporate expectations through his 20-minute silent performance on a stool. Let me analyze each response in detail. Strengths. This response excels in atmospheric detail and emotional progression. It effectively builds tension through the crowd's evolving reaction from confusion to recognition. The dialogue feels authentic, particularly Dean's quiet responses to the heckler. The pacing is well managed, showing the gradual transformation of the audience's understanding. The ending with the cocktail waitress provides a strong emotional anchor. Weaknesses. The response occasionally relies on somewhat generic descriptions and could benefit from more specific sensory details. The executive's reaction is mentioned but not fully explored, missing an opportunity to show the power dynamics at play. Strengths. This response has the strongest emotional resonance and most vivid imagery. The opening metaphor of the room holding its breath is particularly effective. The description of Dean's transformation from persona to person is masterfully handled. The specific details about audience members, mum and rying, man reaching for his wife's hand, create powerful visual moments. The contrast between the two types of applause is brilliantly executed. Weaknesses. Some phrases feel slightly overwrought. The timeline could be clearer about when exactly Dean begins speaking versus sitting in silence. Strengths. This response provides the clearest structure and most detailed progression of events. The executive's reaction is well developed, showing the business versus artistic conflict effectively. The heckler interaction is particularly well crafted, with Dean's response feeling both vulnerable and profound. The ending effectively captures the transformative impact on multiple characters. Weaknesses. Some descriptions feel less cinematic than the other responses. The pacing occasionally rushes through emotional beats that could be developed further. All three responses agree on the core elements. Dean sits on a stool, speaks vulnerably for 20 minutes, never sings, and receives a different kind of standing ovation. The house on Mountain Drive held its breath after Dean was gone, settling into the kind of silence that feels less like peace and more like waiting. Deanna moved through rooms that still carried the ghost of his aftershave, past the bathrobe hanging on the bedroom door like he might return any minute to shrug it on and ask what all the fuss was about. She'd been putting off his study, the one room he'd guarded with gentle privacy, where he'd sit alone when the house got too full of other people's expectations, or too empty of his own purpose. The room smelled of old leather and faded cologne, lined with scripts and songbooks that told the official story of his career. But tucked away on a high shelf, pushed behind the leather-bound evidence of his fame, sat an ordinary shoebox. Scuffed brown cardboard, unremarkable as a tax return, the kind of container you'd forget existed. When she lifted it, something shifted inside with the soft whisper of paper against paper, and the weight of it suggested secrets that had been waiting 30 years to breathe. Inside were letters. Hundreds of them, yellowed envelopes organized by year with rubber bands gone brittle with time, postmarked from every corner of America. They weren't fan mail asking for autographs or declaring undying love. These letters began the same way. Over and over, I was in the audience that night. And as Deanna began to read, she realized she was holding evidence of a miracle her father never talked about, but apparently never forgot. A truck driver from Milwaukee wrote in careful script about celebrating his anniversary at the Copa Room that September night, sitting with his wife in silence that had grown thick with months of fighting and the weight of impending divorce. They'd come to Vegas because they didn't know what else to do with the space between them. When Dean sat on that stool and started talking about loneliness in crowds, about the exhaustion of pretending everything was fine. Robert's wife had reached for his hand for the first time in months. "We talked that night," he wrote. "Really talked. We're still together. Our daughter was born last spring. Thank you for being honest when we couldn't be." In the margin, Dean had written in his neat handwriting, "Glad you made it work." Another letter, the paper thin as tissue, came from a woman in Phoenix whose handwriting trembled across the page. She'd been 3 weeks sober that September night, sitting in the back of the Copa room, wondering if sobriety was worth the unbearable clarity it brought to a world that suddenly had too many sharp edges. When Dean revealed the apple juice masquerading as whiskey, when he admitted that the drunk act was just that, an act, something fundamental shifted in her understanding of what strength actually looked like. "You showed me that pretending to be broken isn't the same as actually being broken," she wrote. "I've been sober 18 years now. I have grandchildren who will never see me drunk." Beside this, Dean had penciled "proud of you." The letters revealed a secret economy of kindness that Dean had operated like a clandestine intelligence network. Thank you notes for college tuitions paid anonymously for the children of musicians he barely knew. A letter from that cocktail waitress who'd been crying in the dark that night, scheduled to be fired the next morning and replaced by someone younger and cheaper. Because Dean hadn't rushed through his set, because he'd let the evening breathe and linger, she'd made enough tips from a thoughtful, unhurried crowd to pay off her debts. More than that, his rebellion had rippled through the casino's management, forcing them to reconsider their systematic removal of longtime staff. She eventually became one of Vegas's first female pit bosses, breaking barriers in an industry that had written her off. "All because you sat on a stool," she wrote, and reminded them we were human. There were letters from children who'd been in the audience, brought by parents for a special night out, too young to understand what they were witnessing, but old enough to remember the feeling. A boy who became a teacher traced his entire approach to education back to that night, to watching a room full of adults discover permission to be vulnerable. A Korean War veteran finally told his family about his nightmares after hearing Dean talk about the mask men wear. A young comedian stopped trying to be someone else and found his own voice. Dean had kept every single one, never showing them to publicists or framing them for his office walls. In a town built on publicity, where charity was performed only when cameras were rolling, he had hoarded these private victories like sacred relics. Deanna found evidence that before difficult performances, especially in his later years when the losses mounted and the loneliness became harder to disguise, Dean would come to this room and reread these crumbling pages. They were his reminder that being real, even for 20 minutes, could change lives forever. That the cost of authenticity was always worth paying. As she traced his careful folding of each envelope, his marginal notes of encouragement to strangers he'd never meet, Deanna realized that for all the gold records and sold-out shows and Hollywood contracts, these fragile private pages were the only reviews he'd ever truly believed. They were proof that on one September night when a casino executive tried to turn him into a machine, Dean Martin had chosen to be magnificently, dangerously human instead. And somewhere in America, people were still living different lives because he'd made that choice. The ripples of that 20-minute rebellion were still spreading, 30 years later, in marriages that survived, and addictions that ended, and dreams that found the courage to be spoken aloud. The shoebox had held his real legacy all along, written in the shaky handwriting of strangers who'd become witnesses to the moment a legend remembered he was also a man. The morning after the rebellion, Las Vegas woke up with a hangover that had nothing to do with alcohol. In the executive offices high above the Strip, men in expensive suits spoke in careful euphemisms over coffee that had gone cold. Dean Martin had become what they feared most in a town built on predictable odds. A variable. The word circulated through hushed phone calls like a diagnosis. Unpredictable, they said, and the way they said it carried the chill of a stock market crash. Variables made the numbers harder to control, and controlled numbers were the only religion these men truly understood. The consequences arrived wrapped in corporate politeness. Booking agents who'd fought each other for the privilege of hosting Dean suddenly discovered scheduling conflicts that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. Contracts became more specific, hedged with language about brand alignment and audience expectations. Underneath the formal phrases lay a single, terrifying question. If he chose honesty over illusion once, what was to stop him from doing it again? In a business where reliability meant everything, Dean had committed the cardinal sin of being genuinely surprising. But while the money men worried about their spreadsheets, something unexpected was happening on the ground. The people who'd been in the Copa room that night couldn't stop talking about it. Their stories spread through Vegas like wildfire through dry desert brush, growing and shifting as stories do, but always maintaining the same electric core. Dean Martin had done something real in a city built on beautiful fakery, and it had been more thrilling than any scripted performance could ever be. His core audience, the people who'd loved him not despite his flaws but because of them, became more devoted than ever. They started requesting him specifically, showing up early to guarantee seats, hungry for whatever truth he might offer next. Frank Sinatra heard about it before the newspapers did. Vegas was small that way, information moving faster than dice across felt. When he called from Palm Springs, his voice carried that particular tone of affectionate exasperation reserved for people who break unspoken rules. "What the hell were you thinking, Dag?" The nickname hung between them, intimate as a shared secret. Dean could hear ice clinking in a glass, could picture Frank pacing in that restless way he had when he was trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. People pay good money to forget their problems, not to hear about yours. They come for the dream, pal. Dean took a long drag on his cigarette, watching smoke curl toward the ceiling of his suite. Maybe they needed to hear it, Pally. Maybe they're tired of the dream. There was a pause, the kind that contained decades of friendship and unspoken understanding. Maybe, Frank conceded, and there was something in his voice that might have been respect or concern or both. Just don't get too real on them. They can't handle it. Hell, most days I can't handle it. Another pause, heavier this time. Just be careful. The business needs you to be Dean Martin, not Dino Crescetti. But that was precisely the problem Dean found himself wrestling with in the months that followed. He'd spent so long being Dean Martin that he'd almost forgotten how to be anything else. And that night on the stool had reminded him there was still a scared kid from Steubenville somewhere underneath all the polish and performance. The question was whether the world had room for both versions, or if choosing authenticity meant abandoning the character that had made him famous. His television variety show became his laboratory for finding that balance, a weekly experiment in showing different facets of himself without completely shattering the illusion. Some episodes leaned into the drunk act, giving audiences the comfortable fantasy they craved. Others let the mask slip just enough to reveal the thoughtful, sensitive man underneath. He refused to rehearse, reading cue cards cold, laughing at his own mistakes, turning the polished veneer of network television into something that felt like hanging out in someone's living room. It was a direct continuation of that night on the stool, a refusal to be perfect, a celebration of the beautiful glitch in the machine. America loved it, but the cost was accumulating like interest on a debt Dean hadn't realized he was taking on. To maintain that level of effortless vulnerability while the world demanded a superstar was exhausting in ways he'd never anticipated. Every performance became a negotiation between who he was and who people needed him to be. Some nights he'd come off stage exhilarated, feeling like he'd found the perfect balance between authenticity and entertainment. Other nights he'd sit alone in his dressing room, staring at his reflection and wondering which version was the real one, or if he'd performed for so long that there was no original left to find. The ripples of his rebellion began spreading through an industry built on perfection. Young performers whispered about that legendary stool moment like a secret ritual, and some of them started taking similar risks. A comedian abandoned his safe material to talk about his depression. A singer stopped lip-syncing and let her imperfect human voice fill the room. Not everyone succeeded. Some careers imploded under the weight of too much honesty too soon. But others discovered that audiences were hungrier for authenticity than anyone had realized, tired of beautiful lies and ready for beautiful truths. As the years accumulated and the losses began to mount, the memory of that September night became both comfort and haunting. When his son Dean Paul died in a plane crash, when the grief became so overwhelming that even breathing felt like a performance he didn't have the strength to give, the mask finally shattered completely. The cool that had protected him for so long offered no shelter from the storm of a father's pain. The industry that had once questioned his reliability now watched a man truly broken by life, and they didn't know where to look. Yet in those later years when young performers approached him at parties or in quiet moments backstage, they wouldn't ask about the movies or the Rat Pack legends. They'd ask about the silence. They'd heard the story of the night he sat down and held a room captive with nothing but presence. They'd ask if it was true that you could move people just by being honest. And Dean, eyes tired but still sharp, would nod slowly. He'd tell them that the hardest thing in the world wasn't hitting the high note or landing the punchline. The hardest thing was trusting that you were enough, just as you were, without the lights and the band and the thunderous applause. Dean Martin would perform thousands more shows before the curtain finally fell, but he never forgot the price of that September rebellion. He carried the knowledge that he had once chosen his soul over his salary, and while it had cost him the comfort of being a simple product, it had bought him something far more valuable. Proof that being real, even for 20 minutes, could matter more than 20 years of flawless performance. Late at night, when the world was quiet and the applause had faded into memory, he would return to those fragile letters in the shoebox, evidence that his moment of truth had rippled outward in ways he'd never fully see, changing lives and giving permission for others to be magnificently, dangerously human. His rebellion had cost him some bookings and made some executives nervous, but it had saved something far more precious, the part of himself that remembered what it felt like to be real. The letter arrived on Christmas morning, 1995, sliding through the mail slot with a whisper of paper against hardwood. By the time it landed in the empty house on Mountain Drive, Dean Martin had already drawn his final breath in the pre-dawn darkness, leaving the world while his voice still echoed from radios playing holiday standards. The envelope sat patient as a prayer, waiting for someone to understand what it meant. When Deanna found it 3 days later, her hands still trembling from funeral arrangements and the surreal weight of a world without her father's laughter in it, she discovered not fan mail but testimony. The return address read Portland, Oregon. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the penmanship of someone who understood that words on paper were sacred things. His name was Michael Brennan, and in September of that legendary night, he'd been 7 years old, dragged to Vegas by a father who'd saved for months to celebrate a 10th wedding anniversary. Tom Brennan was a construction foreman, a man built of concrete and silence, who believed emotions were luxuries working-class families couldn't afford. He'd grown up listening to Dean's records in his own father's workshop, finding something in that voice that made 12-hour days feel a little more bearable. Michael remembered being tired that night, his small legs dangling from the velvet chair, wanting to return to the magic of room service and television. Then Dean Martin walked out, and even at 7, Michael sensed something electric in the air, a tension that made the adults lean forward like they were witnessing something unprecedented. When Dean sat on that stool and the music stopped, Michael watched his father reach over and take his mother's hand. Such a small gesture, barely noticeable in a room holding its breath, but Michael saw everything. His mother's surprise, then the way her fingers curled around his father's palm like she was afraid he might disappear. They'd been married 10 years, but somewhere along the way, they'd stopped touching except in the practical ways that keeping a household running required. Dean talked for 20 minutes, and Michael didn't understand the words about loneliness and masks and the exhaustion of pretending. But he understood tone. He understood the way his father's shoulders began to shake, the way this supposed comedy show had transformed into something else entirely. For the first time in his young life, he saw his father cry. Not dramatic sobs, just silent tears sliding down the face of a man who'd always seemed carved from stone. The real miracle, Michael wrote, was what happened next. His father came home different. Not dramatically, not in ways that would make headlines, but Tom Brennan started asking his children about their days and actually listening to the answers. He began kissing his wife goodbye in the mornings, real kisses that made Michael and his sister giggle and cover their eyes. He coached Little League not from obligation, but from desire to be present in his children's lives in ways his own father never had been. Years later, when Michael struggled with a suffocating pressure to be perfect, his father told him about that night, about watching a man at the absolute peak of fame choose honesty over performance, about how Dean Martin had given him permission to be imperfect and still worthy of love. Tom told his son that strength and sensitivity weren't opposites, that the bravest thing a man could do was admit when he was tired of pretending he wasn't tired. Michael became a teacher because of that lesson, carrying forward the gift his father had received from a stranger on a stool. He taught English at a public high school where most students came from homes like the one he'd grown up in, places where money was tight and emotions were tighter. Every year, he told them about the night Dean Martin stopped performing and started being human, teaching them that admitting you don't understand something is braver than pretending you do. Dean Martin died on Christmas morning without ever reading that letter, but the words reached their destination anyway. The obituaries remembered the drunk act, the movies, the effortless cool that defined an era. The headlines reduced him to a caricature, the lovable lush who stumbled through life making it look easy. But somewhere in America, in classrooms and living rooms and quiet moments between fathers and sons, the real Dean Martin lived on. The Coper Room was demolished years ago, reduced to rubble and progress, but the ghost of that September night remains. Dean Martin's greatest performance was the night he stopped performing altogether, sitting eternally on a plain wooden stool in our collective memory, proving that the most powerful thing you can do is stop pretending and start being human. That 20 minutes of dangerous, beautiful honesty still echoes every time someone chooses authenticity over applause, character over celebrity, the harder truth over the easier lie. He showed an entire generation that you didn't have to be perfect to be loved, just brave enough to be broken in front of people who expected you to be whole.